The Pinnacle was less a club and more a fortress built of arrogance. Tucked away on the highest floor of the city's oldest skyscraper, it was a sanctuary for old money and rigid, inherited success. Everything about it screamed exclusivity, from the muted mahogany-paneled walls to the hushed, judgmental silence that followed any newcomer who dared to breathe too loudly. My name is Sarah, and at 24 years old, I was desperately trying to claw my way into that world. Not because I admired them, but because I was determined to prove that merit could defeat birthright. I was a self-made tech entrepreneur, a woman who built her first successful app in her cramped apartment, wearing clothes from a discount rack, fueled by ramen and ambition. The members of the Pinnacle, men and women whose primary professional skill seemed to be having the right last name, were not my people, but their acceptance felt like the final validation I needed. My initial introduction to the Pinnacle was through Marcus Thorne, a mid-level venture capitalist who had invested a small amount in my company. He invited me to a networking reception, stressing that I needed to dress the part and speak their language. I spent an uncomfortable amount of money on a borrowed designer dress and practiced my elevator pitch until my throat ached. I remember walking into the main lounge, the cavernous space filled with the low hum of expensive conversation, feeling every single pair of eyes on me, not with admiration, but with clinical assessment. My energy felt too bright. My dress, despite its cost, felt too new. My laughter, when I finally managed it, felt too loud. The atmosphere was an oppressive, suffocating form of social warfare. These weren't friendly business leaders, they were gatekeepers. I watched as they performed their subtle ritual of inclusion, nodding politely to those who belonged and freezing out anyone who didn't fit their narrow, aristocratic mold. The type they accepted was predictable: generational wealth, conservative style, and the quiet assurance of having never truly fought for anything. I had fought for everything. I spent an hour awkwardly trying to network, my pitch about my innovative new software being met with glazed-over eyes and dismissive hand waves. I finally cornered an older member, Mr. Harrison, a man whose face was a permanent expression of boredom. I was mid-sentence, passionately explaining my company's rapid growth, when he interrupted me with a voice as dry as dust. "Ms. Hayes," he said, not even attempting to hide his condescension, "the Pinnacle is not a place for hustle stories. We value proven stability, and frankly, dear, your enthusiasm is disruptive." Sting of his words was immediate, but I brushed it off. I was a fighter, after all. I took a deep breath, ready to pivot and try again, convinced that if I just said the right thing, I could earn my place. I was profoundly wrong. The rejection was about to become public, humiliating, and permanent. It was the moment that planted the seed of revenge I would spend the next decade cultivating. The polite dismissal from Mr. Harrison was merely the prelude. My attempt to recover, to find another face and try a less aggressive pitch, led me to a group huddled near the club's grand marble fireplace, the epicenter of the Pinnacle's power structure. This group included Mrs. Albright, a formidable woman whose generational wealth had clearly immunized her from basic human kindness, and Richard Vance, a young man who viewed the world through the narrow lens of his father's trust fund. I approached them with a rehearsed smile, introducing myself and mentioning the success of my tech company's beta launch. Mrs. Albright cut me off before I could finish the first sentence. She didn't use words. She used a dismissive wave of her hand and a loud, theatrical sigh directed at Richard. "Honestly, Richard, are they letting anyone up here now? This isn't a convention floor." Richard Vance, sensing his cue, turned to me with a look of cold, almost surgical cruelty. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is the Pinnacle. Membership isn't about apps or betas. It's about lineage and belonging. You're simply not the type we cultivate here." The way he spat out the word type made it sound like a contagious disease. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just a rejection of my pitch. It was a rejection of me, my effort, my background, my very existence as a self-made woman in a room full of inherited privilege. I tried to maintain composure, ready to retreat with dignity, but Richard wasn't finished. He gestured toward the velvet ropes near the entrance. "I'm sure you're very busy, Ms. Hayes. Why don't you take your disruptive energy elsewhere?" His tone was so loud that the hushed room went completely silent. Every head turned. The humiliation was total, public, and absolute. Then came the physical removal. A discreet but heavily built doorman, who had been hovering near the service entrance, materialized and placed a hand firmly on my elbow. The message was clear: my presence was offensive. As the doorman gently but firmly steered me toward the elevator, I caught Richard's smug, triumphant grin and Mrs. Albright's expression of icy, satisfied superiority. They had judged me, found me wanting, and publicly excised me from their pristine world. Standing on the street minutes later, the crisp evening air was a sharp, painful contrast to the suffocating warmth of the club. I peeled off the expensive rented dress and felt a fierce, burning anger ignite in my core. The shame melted away, replaced by an absolute cold-blooded vow. They had kicked me out for not fitting their type? Fine, their type was obsolete. I realized then that I didn't want their acceptance. I wanted their extinction. I wasn't just going to build my own successful company. I was going to achieve a level of power that would allow me to walk back into that mahogany fortress and not just be a member, but become the new owner, utterly dismantling their entire prejudiced kingdom, brick by arrogant brick. The memory of the doorman's hand on my elbow and Richard Vance's sneering face didn't fade. It became the furnace driving my ambition. For the next 5 years, I was completely consumed by my work. The humiliation I felt on the pavement outside the pinnacle didn't just motivate me. It gave my entire professional life a specific, laser-focused purpose. My goal was no longer just to succeed. It was to acquire the power necessary to utterly dismantle the structures that protected people like the Vances and the Albrights. I focused relentlessly on scaling my tech company, a logistics and supply chain software platform. This wasn't a glamorous business, but it was essential, complex, and incredibly profitable. My life during this period was the absolute antithesis of the Pinnacle's luxurious ease. While they were sipping vintage scotch in hushed rooms, I was pulling all-nighters fueled by cheap coffee, debugging code in fluorescent-lit offices. The contrast framing was stark. They inherited a fortune. I had to earn every single penny under extreme pressure. There were countless moments of doubt and financial strain, but whenever I felt like giving up, I'd picture Mrs. Albright's disgusted expression, and the energy would flood back. My resentment wasn't a destructive emotion. It was a cold, precise fuel. My breakthrough came with a major contract, a national distribution deal that provided the critical mass of revenue and valuation I needed. The venture capital rounds that followed weren't small checks. They were massive investments that propelled my company's valuation into the hundreds of millions. I wasn't just wealthy, I was generating real, liquid capital. I finally moved out of my cramped apartment and into a space that reflected my success, but I kept my lifestyle quiet. I rejected the trappings of old money and maintained the ethos of the self-made outsider. I never forgot where I came from or the moment I was cast out. It was during the finalization of the Series C funding that I first mentioned the Pinnacle to my financial advisor. I spoke not of bitterness, but of strategic acquisition. I want to know everything about that club, I told him. Its legal structure, its owners, its financial health. I explained the rejection, the cold dismissal. His initial response was amusement, but he quickly realized I was deadly serious. This wasn't a personal whim. It was a business objective wrapped in a 10-year-old grudge. My advisor connected me with a discreet corporate intelligence firm. I wasn't interested in personal gossip. I needed data. I needed to know the club's vulnerabilities. The idea of the new owner was still a distant fantasy, but now it felt achievable. I was no longer the broke entrepreneur begging for validation. I was a major player with the financial muscle to buy and bury institutions. The seed of revenge had finally blossomed into a financial weapon, and I was about to turn my focus from building my own success to acquiring the site of my greatest humiliation. The next few years were a whirlwind of massive contracts, strategic hiring, and technological expansion. My company, which had started as a solo operation, was now a leader in supply chain optimization, and the revenue growth was staggering. I wasn't just a successful entrepreneur. I was rapidly approaching the financial leagues of people who own buildings, not just rent office space. The memory of Richard Vance's sneer had evolved from raw fuel into a cold, strategic ambition. I had achieved my personal goals, but the secondary, more satisfying objective remained. dismantling the pinnacle. My first major taste of absolute financial freedom came after the acquisition of a competitor, a deal that required a 9-figure cash payout. That day, sitting across the table from my legal team, I finally felt the true, insulating power of wealth. It wasn't about the cars or the jewelry. It was about the ability to execute any vision, no matter how audacious. That's when I authorized the corporate intelligence firm to launch its deep dive investigation into the pinnacle. The intelligence report that landed on my desk 3 weeks later was a fascinating study in decay. The club wasn't built on a sustainable business model. It was built on a crumbling old money structure that relied on massive fixed endowments and the slow, consistent dues of an aging membership. My investigator, a man named Mr. Finch, who specialized in discrete asset valuation, painted a clear picture of slow, internal bleed. The younger generation of members lacked the immense wealth of their parents, and they resented the crippling annual dues, leading to a steady, quiet attrition. Furthermore, the club's real estate asset, the space it occupied, was a liability. The board had been so focused on maintaining the illusion of exclusivity that they had rejected every offer to modernize or capitalize on their prime location. The report highlighted a critical flaw. The pinnacle was governed by an antiquated, inflexible charter. It couldn't sell individual memberships to stabilize cash flow, and its endowment funds were tied up in poorly performing legacy investments, dictated by the very board members who judged me. Mr. Finch's summary was concise. They're cash poor, asset rich, and suffering from acute mismanagement due to excessive pride. They need capital, and they need it fast. The final piece of information was the most crucial: a rumor of a distressed sale. The board was secretly exploring options to find a massive cash infusion, potentially involving the sale of the club's non-real estate assets, or, more drastically, a complete buyout of the operating charter, which had a silent, complex exit clause. The anonymous buyer had to move quickly and decisively to seize the opportunity before the board, in its arrogance, managed to find a smaller, less invasive solution. I realized my window was opening. The people who had judged me for not fitting their type were now financially vulnerable, and I had the exact type of wealth, liquid, strategic, and enormous, needed to take them down. My revenge was no longer a dream. It was a hostile takeover waiting to be executed. The investigation provided by Mr. Finch confirmed my deepest suspicions. The veneer of exclusivity at the pinnacle was paper thin. While the members presented an image of unbreakable inherited wealth, the institution itself was suffering from severe structural atrophy. The club was designed for an era that no longer existed, focused on legacy over liquidity. Mr. Finch's subsequent reports, delivered bi-weekly and always encrypted, painted a picture of accelerating decay. He detailed several embarrassing incidents: a broken heating system in the members' gym that went unrepaired for 6 months due to budgetary constraints, and the increasingly desperate attempts by the membership committee, led ironically by Richard Vance's father, to recruit new, wealthy members to plug the growing financial holes. The club's rigid adherence to its discriminatory type was proving to be its financial undoing. They would rather face bankruptcy than admit a self-made person, a truth that satisfied the cold, strategic part of my brain. I learned that the board had recently endured a massive, silent, internal fight. A faction of slightly less aristocratic members wanted to modernize the charter, perhaps selling the club's adjacent parking structure for development. But the traditionalists, the Albrights and Vances, rejected any change they perceived as diluting the club's purity. Their pride was a financial liability, and I was about to capitalize on it. The critical piece of information arrived in an urgent email from Mr. Finch. The rumor of a sale was solidifying into a formal mandate. The club's endowment had taken a massive hit in the latest market downturn, and the bank holding the mortgage on the building's upper space was demanding immediate repayment on a legacy loan. The board, finally out of options and desperate to maintain their personal reputations, had quietly hired an obscure brokerage firm to solicit bids for a complete, confidential takeover of the club's operating charter and remaining assets. This wasn't a partial sale. It was an absolute surrender. The board's criteria for the anonymous buyer were tragically predictable. They wanted a buyer who would maintain the club's structure, and most importantly, keep their names out of the public bankruptcy records. They wanted the financial problem to disappear without the social humiliation of admitting failure. The asking price was immense, but it was well within the liquid capital reserves of my consolidated financial holdings. This confirmed my revenge plan was viable. They needed massive cash, and I had it. The clock was now ticking. I instructed Mr. Finch and my legal team to activate the next phase, the acquisition plan. Every single step had to be masked. I mandated the use of 3 separate layered shell corporations to make the initial offer. My name, Sarah Hayes, the tech entrepreneur who dared to wear the wrong dress and speak too loudly, was to be kept entirely out of the negotiation process. I wasn't buying a club. I was buying a weapon for justice, and the element of surprise was the most valuable component. I smiled, a cold, hard, triumphant expression. They had created the perfect financial target, and I was exactly the type of buyer they should have feared the most. The acquisition of the Pinnacle had to be executed with the precision of a high-stakes corporate espionage mission. My greatest advantage was the board's own arrogance. They were so convinced that any serious buyer would be another wealthy, old-guard figure who valued their traditions that they failed to consider a completely anonymous, ruthlessly efficient competitor. I instructed my team, Mr. Finch, my lead counsel, Mr. Davies, and my financial CFO, to operate entirely under the strictest non-disclosure agreements and through a complex layered structure of holding companies based offshore. My name, Sarah Hayes, was buried so deep it was untraceable to the negotiations. The first step was to build the financial war chest. The asking price was high, not because of the club's profitability, but because of its prime real estate location and the inflated egos of the board members. I had the liquid capital ready, but I moved assets strategically, liquidating certain stock options and consolidating funds into the shell corporations. This was crucial. I had to prove to the board that the anonymous buyer was not only capable of meeting their price, but could do so quickly and quietly, offering the discreet exit they craved. The negotiation wasn't about price, it was about speed and silence. My instructions to Mr. Davies were specific. Do not negotiate the culture, only the contract. Ensure the purchase includes the full operating charter, all physical assets, and, most importantly, the immediate, irrevocable authority to hire and fire any personnel, including the existing board, upon closing. I wanted total, unquestionable control, eliminating any chance of a last-minute power struggle or a legal loophole they could exploit to retain their precious traditions. The counterbids, as reported by Mr. Finch, were predictably weak. They came from established real estate developers who wanted to tear the club down or from other aging social institutions that wanted to merge. None of them could match the all-cash, no contingencies offer that my shell corporation placed on the table. The board, blinded by the size of the check and desperate to avoid public shame, was easily seduced by the mysterious, deep-pocketed buyer who promised a swift, quiet closing. I remember Mr. Davies' call after the preliminary agreement was signed. The terms are locked, Sarah. We got everything. They never once asked for the beneficial owner's name, only reassurance that the new entity respected the heritage of the property. They are focused entirely on the cash, not the continuity. The irony was delicious. They kicked me out for not fitting their type, and in doing so, created the perfect financial vacuum for a buyer who would erase their type completely. We were only weeks away from the final signature. The quiet, relentless work was done. Soon, the only thing left was the dramatic, satisfying act of walking back through those polished doors, not to beg for entry, but to sign their termination notices. The final weeks of the acquisition were a masterclass in controlled suspense. The Pinnacle's board, desperate but attempting to project an air of leisurely control, dragged out the process. They requested additional assurances that the buyer entity, my layered shell corporations, would not disrupt the club's sacred traditions. I instructed Mr. Davies to use boilerplate language, assuring them of respect for the property, never the policies. He relayed the board's growing panic. They had exhausted their lines of credit, and the bank's repayment deadline was looming like a financial guillotine. Their desperate need for cash was now my ultimate leverage. The key players in this final standoff were, predictably, the most arrogant ones. Richard Vance's father, a man named Mr. Edmund Vance, and Mrs. Albright were the two loudest voices on the board, clinging to the antiquated charter with white knuckles. They were the very people who had orchestrated my humiliation. They argued vociferously against the anonymous nature of the bid, calling the mystery buyer uncivilized, yet they couldn't deny the size of the check. The final vote came down to pure financial survival over social pride. Survival won. The board formally accepted the offer from the Apex Holdings Group, the final layer of my shell company, for the full charter and assets. The agreed-upon condition was a closing date set for the following Monday, allowing them to escape the bank deadline and publicly announce the club was restructured and debt-free, thereby saving their reputation, or so they thought. The final complex contract was signed and sealed, a document that gave me total, immediate, and unilateral power over all club affairs. I remember the call from Mr. Davies that Friday afternoon. His voice was quiet with restrained triumph. "It's done, Sarah. Every T is crossed, every I is dotted. The funds have transferred. The club charter is officially recorded in the name of Apex Holdings. You are legally and financially the new and sole owner of the Pinnacle. The deed of ownership will be physically transferred to the property on Monday morning." He paused. "What do you want to do first?" I looked at the framed photo of my old, cramped apartment that I kept in my spacious, state-of-the-art office, my personal contrast frame. "The first thing I want to do is attend the Monday morning meeting," I told him, my voice colder than I expected. "I want the board members, specifically Mr. Vance and Mrs. Albright, to be present. I want to personally accept the deed and inform them of the immediate change in management." The feeling wasn't pure excitement, it was a deep, cold satisfaction. I had channeled my rejection, my anger, and my humiliation into a relentless decade of work, and that work had purchased their arrogance. I had gone from being the wrong type to the only type that mattered, the owner. Monday was not just a business closing. It was the final, devastating act of a perfectly executed comeback. I was ready to trade my successful tech uniform for a power suit and walk back into that mahogany fortress, not as a desperate hopeful, but as their final, inevitable boss. Monday morning arrived sharp and bright. I chose my attire with meticulous care, a tailored suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe from the day I was humiliated, but which carried none of the arrogance of the club members. It was a uniform of quiet, undeniable power. Mr. Davies, my counsel, met me in the lobby. He carried a single, unassuming leather portfolio containing the deed of ownership. We rode the elevator up to the Pinnacle for the final closing meeting, the same elevator that had carried me out in disgrace years before. The silence of the ascent was thick with anticipation. The club's main lounge, usually reserved for leisurely breakfast meetings, was filled with a tense, formal atmosphere. The full board of directors was gathered, including Mrs. Albright, Richard Vance, and his father, Mr. Edmund Vance. They looked relieved and slightly smug, expecting to meet some anonymous institutional investor who would quietly take over their debt and disappear. They nodded politely to me and Mr. Davies, assuming we were just part of the new buyer's legal entourage. Mr. Edmund Vance, radiating the kind of effortless entitlement that had fueled my decade of work, tapped his pen against the mahogany table. "Well, let's expedite this, gentlemen. Where is the representative from Apex Holdings? We have other meetings." Mr. Davies pushed the leather portfolio toward me. I opened it and removed the crisp, notarized deed. I didn't sit down. I walked to the head of the table, placing the document in front of Mr. Vance. I looked directly at him, then at Mrs. Albright, whose eyes were still assessing me with clinical disdain. "There's been a slight change in the meeting agenda," I said, my voice cutting through the room's hushed dignity. I didn't shout. I simply spoke with the absolute authority of the financial master. "I am the representative of Apex Holdings. My name is Sarah Hayes." The effect was instantaneous and stunning. Mr. Vance's jaw literally dropped. Mrs. Albright's composure shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, open-mouthed horror. Richard Vance, who was leaning against the fireplace, straightened up as if struck by lightning. The silence was heavier than any I had experienced in that room. "You?" Mr. Vance finally sputtered, his face flushing crimson. The little tech girl? This is absurd. This is a joke. It is not a joke, Mr. Vance, I replied, gesturing to the deed. As of 9:08 a.m. this morning, I am the sole owner of the Pinnacle and all its operating assets, charter, and property leases. You signed the document and took the money. You failed to look past the money and investigate the buyer. I let the devastating truth hang in the air. You didn't think I was the type to belong here. You were correct. I am the type who buys places like this. I turned to the club manager, who was standing terrified in the doorway. Effective immediately, the club manager is relieved of his duties. Mr. Davies will be your temporary administrator. Then I looked back at the board members, specifically at Richard Vance. And for the board members present, your positions and memberships are terminated. You have exactly 1 hour to clear your personal effects before security escorts you from the premises. The look on their faces, the utter annihilating shock, was the sweetest justice imaginable. The comeback was complete. The ensuing hour was delicious, cathartic chaos. Mr. Edmund Vance and Mrs. Albright, pale with shock and indignation, initially refused to leave, demanding to see a real owner and threatening lawsuits. Richard Vance, whose face was a mask of impotent rage, tried to rally the other board members. They couldn't grasp the cold legal reality. They had signed away their entire institution for a large lump sum, and the person they rejected was now the undisputed master of their universe. My first official act as owner was immediate and public. I addressed the remaining staff, the very people who had watched me get escorted out years ago, and fired the club manager and the security chief who had placed his hand on my arm. I gave them generous severance but made it clear. The era of judgmental exclusion was over. Then came the rules change. I didn't want the club. I wanted to dismantle its culture and repurpose its assets. The mahogany-paneled boardroom, their sanctum of privilege, was instantly designated as a free community tech incubator space, open to local entrepreneurs, regardless of their type or background. The exclusive library, filled with dusty, unread first editions, was to be converted into a public reading room with free Wi-Fi and open access subscriptions. The membership categories were abolished entirely. The former board members were apoplectic. Mr. Vance marched back in, demanding, "You can't do this. This is a cultural institution. You're destroying decades of tradition." I finally gave him the attention he craved, leveling him with a cold stare. "You sold this building because your decades of tradition led to financial ruin and obsolescence, Mr. Vance. You didn't believe in the modern economy, merit, or anyone who had to actually work for their wealth. I do. And now, the space you used to exclude me will be used to build up the kind of people you tried to shut out. That is the new rule, and I am the new owner." Richard Vance, witnessing his father's humiliation, was reduced to pathetic bargaining. "Sarah, please, we went to school with some of your investors. We can talk about a compromise. Just keep the core membership, keep the name." "The name remains," I told him, "but the rules change. Effective immediately, the membership roster is wiped clean. The club is now a merit-based foundation, providing services to young, self-made professionals who embody the hustle you so despise. You are welcome to submit an application, but given your history of financial mismanagement and prejudice, I highly doubt you'll make the cut." The look on his face, the realization that his entire social identity was now worthless and subject to my approval, was the final, exquisite moment of justice. They had lost their fortress of privilege, and I had transformed the symbol of my greatest humiliation into a monument of empowerment. The transformation of the Pinnacle was swift, brutal, and profoundly satisfying. Within 6 months, the fortress of exclusion was gone, replaced by a dynamic, bustling hub of innovation. The mahogany-paneled dining room, once silent with judgment, was now a lively, shared co-working space, buzzing with the disruptive energy that Mr. Harrison had once despised. The massive endowment I inherited wasn't used to subsidize rich members. It was channeled into seed funding and mentorship programs for entrepreneurs who came from backgrounds exactly like mine, self-made and underestimated. The club wasn't merely surviving, it was thriving under a new, meritocratic model, proving that utility and purpose were far more valuable than obsolete pedigree. The former board members suffered the ultimate social punishment, irrelevance. They couldn't sue because they had signed an airtight sale agreement and had accepted the cash. Their names were associated with the club's financial failure, and they were forced to scramble for new social validation. Mr. Edmund Vance and Mrs. Albright, whose entire identities were wrapped up in their high social standing, found themselves locked out of the very social circles they had policed for decades. Richard Vance, without his father's club to prop him up, struggled to maintain professional respectability. The irony was sweet. They were now the new outsiders, kicked out for not fitting the new type, the type that valued hard work and genuine innovation over inherited privilege. My final reflection took place one evening as I stood in the renovated Pinnacle Commons, the former location of the fireplace where I was publicly humiliated. The room was full of young, diverse entrepreneurs discussing algorithms and venture rounds, their energy bright and loud. I was no longer obsessed with the revenge. The acquisition had cleansed the wound. I realized the profound difference between inherited wealth and earned wealth. Inherited wealth, as demonstrated by the old board, breeds arrogance and inflexibility, ultimately leading to decline. Earned wealth, the kind I possessed, offered freedom and the power to correct injustice. The moment I was kicked out, I didn't lose my dignity. I gained a decade's worth of purpose. They thought they were punishing me for being the wrong type, but in truth, they were funding my education and ambition and giving me the specific, high-stakes target I needed to achieve true financial power. The $200 million, the final calculated value of the consolidated assets and charter. I now oversaw was not just money. It was the ultimate proof that the only type that matters is the one who puts in the work and achieves the result. I had not only bought the club, but I had purchased the most satisfying form of justice: total, irreversible institutional change. My comeback was complete, and the doors of the Pinnacle were now finally open to everyone who had the drive, regardless of their last name.